There had been no other mission like it in history. The use of an atomic bomb for strategic purposes in time of war. The complexity and destructive power of the weapon is well documented. That the little boy dropped on Hiroshima and the fat man dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later caused the Japanese leadership to change its policy of defending the home islands to the last man, woman, and child to one of immediate surrender is a matter of historical fact. It is a singular story of technological genius and the fog of war, magnificent courage, and terrible suffering, diligent planning, and unpredictable happenstance. The mission of the B-29 bomber, called the Enola Gay, and its crew on August 6, 1945, not only changed the Second World War, it changed the face of warfare as we know it until this day. It was, in fact, a mission that changed human history. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the airplane that dropped the atomic bomb, was as much a technological marvel as the bomb itself. It featured innovations like a pressurized cabin, an electronic fire control system, and remote-controlled gun turrets. Its wingspan, 141 feet, was nearly twice the span of Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress. At 155,000 pounds combat weight, the B-29 was one of the largest aircraft to serve in World War II. It went from drawing board to combat in less than 4 years. It went into full production before its prototype flew, and the first B-29s to come off the assembly line were full of problems. But eventually, it became a very capable strategic bomber, and it served the U.S. Air Force through the end of the 1950s. In late 1944, the United States was well on the way to developing an atomic bomb. The U.S. Army Air Forces created a special B-29 bomber group to deliver the bomb. The 509th Composite Group. Its leader was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, one of the 8th Air Force's most experienced B-17 pilots and a test pilot for the B-29 program. Tibbets was tasked with organizing and training 2 special bomb units, one for Germany and one for Japan. As the core of his 509th Composite Group, he chose the 393rd Bomber Squadron, a combat-ready unit of 15 B-29s. In an archival interview, Paul Tibbets talked about the mission.
You got a tremendous amount of responsibility there. You got a tremendous amount of authority. Be careful of how you use it. We're in General Ent's office, and he is instructing me as to my assignment. You are going to organize and train a unit to drop these atomic bombs simultaneously in both Europe and Japan. And he told me about using my code word of silver plate, but he said General Arnold had advised his entire staff in Washington that any requisition with the word silver plate would be honored without question. I reflected back over the things that had been said, knowing that it was going to be the most important thing that I ever did in my life.
he added 3 more factory-fresh B-29s to the group, personally selecting his own aircraft from Boeing's production line. One of his main concerns was how to drop an atomic bomb and get away safely. The bomb would be dropped from 30,000 feet and it would explode 43 seconds later. Tibbets worked out an evasive maneuver that would get his bomber 9 miles from the blast.
The scientists came to us and right at the beginning, and one of them said, "We think you will be okay if you're 9 miles away when the bomb explodes." I can remember looking at the guy and saying, "What the hell do you mean you think?" We could be wrong. Some guys are saying it could be 50 miles away. Some people are saying you can't get far enough away. So you just paid your money, you took your choice.
The 509th trained at an isolated airfield at Wendover, Utah. Their mission was super secret. Only Tibbets and a handful of officers knew what they were training for, though others may have guessed.
We had every telephone coming into Wendover, Utah, or going out, it was tapped. Security was the most important thing that we had to maintain because they didn't want anything to get out.
Tibbets cautioned the men of the 509th not to talk to anyone about the unit and not to speculate about its purpose. Violators quickly found themselves transferred to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, where they could talk as much as they liked to the walruses and seagulls. The air crews practiced navigation and dropped practice bombs called pumpkins that were shaped like the bulbous atomic bomb but filled with conventional high explosives. For maximum altitude and speed, they stripped their B-29s, dumping 7,000 pounds of gun turrets, ammunition, and other gear. Their only remaining armaments were their tail guns. By April 1945, it was clear that the war in Europe was in its final days. The bombers of the 509th now had just one target: Japan. In early May, they began shipping out to Tinian, an island in the Marianas Group, 1,200 miles from the Japanese homeland. Tinian is a 39-square-mile coral island, roughly 5 by 13 miles, in the northern Marianas island chain, 3,700 miles from Hawaii. Claimed by Japan after World War I, it was mainly a sugar plantation under Japanese rule. During World War II, the Japanese built 2 small airfields and launched fighters and light bombers from the island. U.S. Marines invaded the island in July 1944 and secured it on August 1st. 8,000 Japanese soldiers died in the 9-day battle. The Marines lost 328 dead and 1,500 wounded. Several hundred Japanese soldiers remained hidden in Tinian's semi-tropical jungles. The last survivor was captured in 1953. With Tinian secured, 15,000 Seabees moved in to build runways and prepare camps for 50,000 personnel. They built 2 airfields for the B-29s, a total of 6 8,500-foot runways, said to be the longest runways in the world at the time. Tinian became the busiest military airfield in the war. Massed bombing raids from Tinian began in November 1944. On the night of 10 March 1945, 279 B-29s, flying below 6,000 feet, dropped 1,700 tons of bombs on Japan's capital city, Tokyo. The bombs ignited a firestorm that destroyed 16 square miles of the city and killed at least 100,000 Japanese. 14 B-29s were lost. These massed raids continued until the end of the war. On Tinian, the 509th was again shrouded in secrecy. While other B-29 units flew low-level airstrikes on Japan, from which some crews did not return, the planes of the 509th flew milk runs, dropping their pumpkin-shaped bombs from high altitude far out of reach of enemy fighters and flak. Other units began to view Tibbets' crews as pampered misfits who contributed nothing to the war effort. When word slipped out that the group's mission might end the fighting, someone wrote a satirical song called "The 509th is Winning the War." In truth, the group's station on Tinian was not hardship duty. The hours were long, and the work was hard, but there were white coral beaches and a hospital full of pretty nurses to provide recreation. In mid-July, the 509th began flying missions to Japan, dropping their pumpkin bombs on military and industrial targets. In contrast to the huge low-level raids, the 509th sent only 2 or 3 bombers at a time over Japan and bombed in daylight from high altitude, around 30,000 feet. The Japanese began to ignore these daytime attacks. After all, 2 or 3 bombs did little damage compared to the massive nighttime raids. On 17 July, Tibbets received a coded message from General Groves, head of the Manhattan Project. The atom bomb test had been successful. Scientists had set off the world's first atomic explosion at Alamogordo, New Mexico. Up to then, it had all been theories and high hopes. Now, the super weapon was a reality. From Tinian, Colonel Tibbets made 3 round trips to Washington between May and July to work out problems and to discuss target selection for the atom bomb. At first, the list of possible targets included the cities of Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura. All of these cities were important industrial or military centers, and all had been spared from conventional bombing. Kyoto was taken off the list when Secretary of State Henry Stinson pointed out that it had great historic and religious significance to the Japanese.
Remember, up to this time, they had a target committee, and there were a lot of people picking out targets and everything else. These targets, which had never before been bombed by any other means. I knew the 5 of them beforehand, but I didn't know which one it would be. But we were all in favor of Hiroshima. That was where we could do the most good with 1 bomb that we were going to drop and everything else. That's because the Second Army was there. You probably don't realize it, but 25% of the people killed in Hiroshima were military people. And then you had materiel that was going over to Shikoku for the defense of Japan and everything else. You could probably do more good at bombing that than you could have any other city.
The 509th continued to fly practice missions to Japan, dropping their black powder bombs configured in shapes similar to the anticipated atomic bomb. In mid-July, Tibbets learned that the atomic mission might be given to a different B-29 unit. Colonel Butch Blanchard, the senior operations officer on Tinian, had argued that other B-29 crews were more experienced and more qualified. Tibbets countered that the 509th had been training specifically for the atomic bomb mission and were fully competent to fly it. He offered to take Blanchard on a practice mission to prove his point. With Blanchard in the jump seat, Tibbets flew to nearby Rota Island, still held by the Japanese. The Tibbets plane arrived at its target precisely on time and dropped its simulated atom bomb precisely on target. With the bomb away, Tibbets snapped the big bomber into the evasive maneuver his crews had practiced. Blanchard turned pale as the G-forces pinned him to his seat. He declared that he'd seen enough. The 509th would drop the atom bomb.
The B-29 was not supposed to hold together under that maneuver, we later found out. Make the turn when you're coming off is steep enough so your tail starts to stall. Then you know you have the turn steep enough. And just push the throttles forward, lose a couple thousand feet in the turn, and just run like hell.
In the second half of July, the 509th made a dozen conventional raids on Japanese cities, dropping the simulated atom bombs, bulbous, pumpkin-shaped casings filled with black powder or other conventional explosives. The raids avoided cities that were on the atom bomb target list. Their strange tactics, just 2 or 3 bombers at high altitude, confused the Japanese. Fighters almost never tried to intercept the bombers, and anti-aircraft fire couldn't reach the B-29s at 30,000 feet. Gradually, the Japanese became accustomed to seeing small groups of bombers that didn't cause much damage. Although some of the pumpkin-shaped bombs were aimed by radar onto cloud-covered targets, it was decided that the atomic bomb would only be dropped if the target were clearly visible to the bombardier. Colonel Tibbets was prohibited from flying these practice missions to Japan. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded all B-29 combat operations against Japan, declared that Tibbets was too valuable to the atom bomb mission and knew too much to risk falling into Japanese hands. The pumpkin raids proved to Tibbets that his crews were ready for the atom bomb mission. They could deliver the bomb precisely on time and precisely on target. The practice bombing missions also revealed a potentially serious problem in the bomb's design. The fuse that ignited the bombs was a radar-actuated proximity fuse that was supposed to detonate the bomb at 1,890 feet above the ground. But on 2 occasions, the fuse detonated its pumpkin bomb too soon. Once over Wendover and once over the Pacific, the bombs detonated just after leaving the bomb bay at 31,000 feet. The premature explosions did no damage to the planes, but they caused some serious worry among the crews. Tibbets made the last trip to Washington in mid-July. There, it was decided that everything would be ready by the first week of August. Tibbets flew back to Tinian to oversee the final preparations for the mission. On the morning of 26 July, the cruiser USS Indianapolis arrived at Tinian to deliver the firing mechanism and a small slug of uranium for the atomic bomb. The second slug of uranium was delivered by a B-29 from the United States. Halfway between Guam and the Leyte Gulf, in the early hours of July 30, the Indianapolis was hit by 2 Japanese torpedoes. Of the nearly 900 men who went into the water on July 30, only 317 were rescued. It was the worst sea disaster in the history of the U.S. Navy. Back on Tinian, the technicians continued to prepare what some were calling the device. Its final assembly would be done on the day before the mission.
We never called it an atomic bomb at all. How many people in the organization knew enough about atomic energy at that time to guess that we were working on an atomic bomb is beyond me. But if you guessed it, you didn't talk about it, because if you did, you would get sent up the illusions. There's no place like that.
Fat Man, like the atomic bomb tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico in mid-July, was an implosion-type plutonium bomb. A sphere of shaped explosive charges surrounded a smaller sphere of radioactive plutonium. When the explosive charges detonated, the pressure of the explosion compressed the plutonium sphere to critical mass, setting off an uncontrolled atomic reaction. Fat Man would be the second atomic bomb used in combat. The bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima was of a different type than the one tested in New Mexico. This was a rifle-type bomb in which one slug of uranium would be fired into another. The pressure of their impact would push both slugs of uranium to critical mass and trigger the explosion. Little Boy was a simpler design, and the scientists considered it more reliable than the implosion-type Fat Man. But in fact, a rifle-type atomic bomb like Little Boy had never been tested. Its first use as a weapon would also be its first trial run. America, China, and Britain sent the so-called Potsdam Proclamation to Japan on 26 July. Surrender, it said, or face prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese ignored it. Three days later, General Carl Toohey Spatz arrived on Tinian to take command of the U.S. strategic forces in the Pacific. He brought with him a signed order from General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project. The order authorized the 509th Composite Group to, quote, deliver its first special bomb as soon as weather will permit visual bombing after about 3 August 1945, unquote. The target was to be one of 4 cities: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, or Nagasaki. Paul Tibbets favored Hiroshima. In a handwritten note on the margin of the order, President Truman wrote, quote, release when ready, but not sooner than August 2, unquote. Truman was meeting in Potsdam, Germany with Allied leaders Churchill and Stalin in early August and did not want the bomb dropped until that meeting was over.
I was never challenged. Nobody ever asked me, can I drop the bomb? Or, have you made a decision who's going to drop it? If they had, I'd have told them yes. Decision was made the first day I heard about it, and that's going to be me.
Colonel Paul Tibbets would fly the first atomic bomb mission with a hand-picked crew. Captain Bob Lewis, age 25, from Richfield Park, New Jersey, would be Tibbets' co-pilot. Lewis had often commanded the aircraft when Tibbets was busy with other duties. Theodore Dutch Van Kirk, navigator, age 24, from Northumberland, Pennsylvania, and Major Tom Farabee, bombardier, age 24, from Mocksville, North Carolina. Both men had been part of Tibbets' regular B-17 flight crew in England.
Tom Farabee was the best poker player I ever saw in the Army. And that's saying a lot. Best crap shooter, too. We met in the nose of a B-17. We were best friends until he died.
Captain William Deke Parsons, age 44, from Chicago, was a U.S. Navy ordnance expert who had worked on the Manhattan Project. He would be responsible for arming and monitoring the atomic bomb during the flight to Japan. He was assisted by Lieutenant Morris R. Jepson, 23, of Logan, Utah. Tech Sergeant Wyatt Dusenberry was the Enola Gay's flight engineer. He had flown in B-17s with Tibbets.
Dusenberry could really get more out of engines than anybody else. He was a master at engines and that sort of thing. The best flight engineer I ever saw.
Lieutenant Jacob Besser, 24, of Baltimore, Maryland, was a radar specialist.
These bombs operated on radar proximity fuses. They had to very accurately measure the height above the ground to get their explosion. If the Japanese had gotten onto the frequency on which they had operated, they could have exploded the bombs in the airplane. But we didn't think that was a very good idea. So we took Jake along, and Jake was our radar countermeasures expert.
Filling out the Enola Gay's 12-man crew were PFC Robert Chamard, assistant flight engineer, Sergeant Joe Staborik, radar operator, PFC Richard Nelson, radio operator, and Tech Sergeant Bob Karen, tail gunner. During the first few days of August, Tibbets gave considerable thought to a name for his airplane. He had no doubt that the first atomic bomber would become a celebrity of sorts, and the current identifier, plane number 82, didn't sound very heroic. he finally decided to name the plane after his mother, Enola Gay Tibbets. She was a strong, caring woman who had much influence on Tibbets' life and values. Bombardier Tom Farabee and navigator Dutch Van Kirk both knew Tibbets' mother and both heartily agreed with his choice. On the 3rd of August, the final order came from General Curtis LeMay, who commanded all B-29 operations in the Pacific. The official order for Special Bombing Mission Number 13 listed Hiroshima as the primary target, followed by Kokura and Nagasaki. If the number 13 worried any of the crew, they never mentioned it. Over the next few days, Tibbets and Farabee pored over huge aerial photographs of the 3 targets, especially Hiroshima. Farabee chose a landmark east of the city as his initial point where he would begin his bomb run. For the aiming point, he chose a bridge in the center of Hiroshima. Of the many bridges across the Ota River, the T-shaped Aioi Bridge would be the easiest to spot from 31,000 feet above the city. With orders to drop the atomic bomb only if the target were visible, Tibbets wanted to be sure of the weather over each city. Not content to rely on long-distance weather forecasts, he decided to send 3 B-29s ahead as weather reconnaissance planes. The planes would leave Tinian about an hour before the Enola Gay. They would fly over the primary target and the 2 alternates and report on weather conditions. 3 other B-29s would leave Tinian with the Enola Gay. One carried scientific instruments to measure the intensity of the atomic explosion. Another carried cameras to photograph the mission and the blast. The 3rd B-29 was a backup plane. It would follow the Enola Gay to Iwo Jima, about halfway to Japan. There, it would land and wait. If the Enola Gay had mechanical problems on the way to Japan, Tibbets would return to Iwo Jima, transfer his crew and the atomic bomb to the backup B-29, and complete the mission. On the morning of the 5th of August 1945, the forecasters said the weather looked good for a mission the next day. Final preparations went into high gear. The Enola Gay was moved to a loading pit while the bomber crew attended a mission briefing. By noon, the atomic bomb was loaded in the B-29's specially modified bomb bay.
And then they told us to go get some sleep. How they expected to tell you you're going to go out and drop the first atomic bomb, which might blow up the airplane, and go get some sleep is absolutely beyond me. I know Tibbets didn't sleep, I knew Farabee didn't sleep, because we were all 3 in the same poker game. And I don't even know who won. It was that bad.
The crews of the 3 strike planes were summoned again about 11 p.m.
They came and got us, final briefing, latest weather information, all that sort of stuff, air-sea rescue, everything of that type. And then over to the final breakfast. And I remember vividly what we had for the final breakfast. Paul Tibbets loved pineapple fritters. I hated the damn things. We had pineapple fritters for breakfast that evening, I should say.
The Japanese were known to be torturing B-29 crewmen who had been shot down over Japan. As Tibbets left the mess hall, the flight surgeon handed him a small pillbox containing 12 cyanide capsules. Tibbets gave one of the capsules to Parsons, but kept the rest to be handed out only in an emergency. Paul Tibbets made it clear to the crew that if the plane were shot down, each man should decide on his own whether or not to commit suicide to avoid capture. The crew arrived at the flight line about 1:45 a.m. to find the Enola Gay bathed in floodlights. General Groves wanted the plane's departure from Tinian to be recorded on film.
We got in trucks, went down to the airplane, and I think when we all got down there, we were all surprised because the plane was lit up by keg lights. It was like a Hollywood premiere, for heaven's sakes. Dick Nelson, who comes from Southern California, said, looks more like a supermarket opening to me. point I want to make, if all the interviewing is being done, all the pictures are being taken and everything of that type, were being done by the Manhattan Project. There was no media on the island at all.
The crew boarded the aircraft and went carefully through their checklists. No one wanted to make the mistake that would jeopardize the mission.
We were very heavily loaded on takeoff. We were about 250,000 max gross weight. Normal max gross weight of a B-29 over there. At that particular time, it was about 235,000.
At 2:45 a.m., Tibbets began his takeoff roll on Tinian's 8,000-foot runway. As the aircraft reached 140 knots, its normal takeoff speed, co-pilot Bob Lewis reached for the control yoke.
I was confident that this was the only way to do it so that I could control with the tail if I had to. So when I'm going down there and I kept it past that magic 140 that Lewis was used to, he started to grab the yoke and pull back on it. He said, lift it off. And I told him, I said, keep your goddamn hands off of that yoke. I'm flying this airplane.
And he was in charge, absolutely. That was Paul Tibbets on an airplane. I don't know what speed we coming off on it, but I know we used every damn foot of that runway.
At 2-minute intervals, the camera plane and instrument plane took off behind Tibbets, followed by the backup B-29. Conventional bombs were usually armed on the ground, but if the Enola Gay were to crash on takeoff, Parsons worried that a fire could set off the atomic bomb's black powder trigger. As the Enola Gay reached its initial cruising altitude of 4,700 feet, Deke Parsons and Lieutenant Jepson climbed into the bomb bay to arm the atomic bomb. While Jepson held a flashlight, Parsons inserted a small slug of uranium and a small explosive charge that would fire one uranium slug into another and trigger the atomic explosion.
I was worried to beat hell. The fact that we had an atom bomb right behind me, didn't concern me a whole lot. The fact that Deke Parsons was back there in the bomb bay, fooling the black powder, that worried me, because I knew what black powder would do.
With the arming task completed, the crew relaxed. Many of them slept, making up for the sleepless days leading up to the mission. The 6-hour flight to Japan seemed routine and uncomplicated in spite of their unique payload.
Use celestial navigation to get up to Iwo Jima, and if you get lost between Iwo Jima and Japan, you are the lousiest navigator in the world. I'm sure there's some people who have done it already, but not many. Because you had a volcanic island sticking up above the ocean, and you could pick them up on radar and lead your way right in.
At 5:55 a.m. Tinian time, the crew sighted Iwo Jima, halfway to the target. The backup airplane, a B-29 named Top Secret, landed there. Tibbets circled the island once to allow the two other B-29s, Great Artiste and an unnamed number 91, to form up on Enola Gay, and the three planes headed for Japan, 3 hours away. At about 7:45 a.m. Tinian time, the Enola Gay climbed to 32,700 feet, her intended bombing altitude. Half an hour later, Tibbets received a coded message sent from Major Etherly, the pilot of Straight Flush, one of the B-29 weather reconnaissance planes. The weather over Hiroshima was suitable for a visual bomb strike. The other two weather planes also sent messages. The skies over Nagasaki were clear, but Kokura was hidden under ground fog. The skies over all three cities were empty of other Allied aircraft. Orders kept them well clear of the possible targets. About 9 a.m. Tinian time, the city of Hiroshima came into view, its white buildings gleaming in the morning sun. Dutch Van Kirk's navigation was near perfect, and the Enola Gay reached the initial point almost precisely on time. Tibbets turned the plane left to a heading of 263 degrees to begin the 3-minute bomb run.
We made the turn to the west. We wanted a bomb on a heading of 270. I missed it. We got on a heading of 263, and we just went in and dropped the bomb. Bomb run was very long. We were having conversations while we were on a bomb run. And Tom Farabee turned around to me once and he said, "Christ Dutch, if we'd have sat on a bomb run this long over Europe, we wouldn't be here." Well, I said, "Is it still on the target?" He says, "It's gone right down the track." He says, "Nothing I can do." You see, when the bombardier is making his bomb run, he's flying the airplane. It's on automatic pilot, everything of that type. And Tom was extremely good at it.
An hour earlier, the B-29 weather plane, straight flush, had set off air raid sirens in Hiroshima, but no fighters rose to attack it.
The Japanese had no defense against high-flying airplanes up until that time, and we were going to be as high as we could get. So we didn't expect any enemy action of any type on this particular mission, and we didn't get any.
10 miles out, Bombardier Tom Farabee spotted his aiming point, the T-shaped AEOE bridge. At 90 seconds from bomb release, Tibbets switched the autopilot and gave the plane to Farabee. The city of Hiroshima was one of Japan's principal seaports. It was an important shipping point for soldiers and equipment. It was also one of the landing points for the Allied amphibious invasion that was planned for November 1945. It was the headquarters of the Imperial Second Army, the Chigoku Regional Army, and the Imperial Army Marines. There were large military supply depots and many small factories for military goods in this city of 420,000 people. The Enola Gay's pneumatic bomb bay doors opened automatically. At 9:15 and 17 seconds Tinian time, the atomic bomb tumbled away. Its burden gone, the Enola Gay pitched sharply upward. Tibbets now had to fly the world's largest bomber as if it were a nimble fighter plane.
We made a right-hand turn, 60-degree bank, lost about 2,000 feet in the turn, pushed the throttles forward, just ran like hell.
Tail gunner Bob Karen felt like the last man in a wild game of crack the whip. Dutch Van Kirk recalls one particular thought as the plane sped away from the release site.
I hope it works. Because, it had never been dropped before. 2 days before, the fusing mechanism didn't work. I think if I'd have been a betting man, I would have bet before we dropped that bomb it was going to be a dud. So everybody was waiting to see whether it did explode and did it work. And then suddenly we saw the bright flash in the airplane. Hallelujah, it had worked. After we were certain we weren't going to get any more shock waves, we turned around to look at what had happened. The first thing we saw was a mushroom-shaped cloud, all different colors within the base of that cloud. And on top of it was a mushroom you could see. It was up well above our altitude already, I'd guess, 40,000 going higher. And then as we turned on around and everything, we could see the city of Hiroshima, and we could make absolutely no visual observation because the entire city was covered with thick black smoke and everything. You want the description of it? I say it looked like a pot of boiling oil down there.
The initial fireball incinerated or vaporized everything in the immediate area of the blast. Beyond that, buildings were flattened, then set on fire. 4 square miles of the central city were destroyed, about 60% of the city's area. The firestorm that erupted after the blast widened the destruction. Estimates put the human toll at 60 to 80,000 dead, and an equal number injured. In Tokyo, many in the civilian government argued for surrender. The Russians were poised to attack Manchuria. The Allied blockade was strangling Japan. There were food shortages. Victory was no longer possible. But Japan's military leaders vowed to continue the war. America, some said, had no more atomic bombs. On 9 August, a B-29 called Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The mission was flawed. The bomb missed its target by nearly half a mile, causing less destruction than at Hiroshima. That same day, the Russians invaded Manchuria. 2 days later, a group of Japanese military commanders met in a plot to seize the government and continue the war. The plot failed when senior officers refused to join the coup d'etat. On 14 August, more than 1,000 American Army and Navy bombers hit Japanese cities. Faced with the total destruction of his nation, the emperor ordered the unconditional surrender of Japan. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the nature of warfare forever. Atomic weapons elevated the role of the strategic bomber and helped give birth to the U.S. Air Force as a separate service. They shaped much of the military and political landscape of the second half of the 20th century. The decision to use atomic bombs on Japan, made jointly by Truman and Churchill, has remained controversial. But one fact cannot be disputed. The use of the bombs was intended first and foremost to end as quickly as possible a terrible war against a ruthless enemy who was determined never to surrender.
Let me say emphatically that there's no way in those days that I could have even considered not wanting to do it. I was anxious to do it. I wanted to do everything that I could to subdue Japan. And in other words, I wanted to kill the bastards. That was the attitude of the United States in those years.
The Battle of Okinawa in early 1945 produced 50,000 Allied casualties and up to 150,000 Japanese casualties. If Japan fought on, Allied leaders feared a score or more of Okinawas to be fought all over Asia.
If you were over there around Tinian, Saipan, Guam at that particular time, you knew that an invasion was going to have a lot of casualties because they were building hospitals all over those islands. We wanted a war to be over. We wanted to stop the killing.
The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was instrumental in ending the Second World War. Tibbets, his crew, more than 1 million American servicemen and women, and the American public were overwhelmingly grateful for the peace that followed. And the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has helped to ensure that such weapons have never again been used in anger.
I'd just like to say to all people that before you say anything critical about what we did and the casualties we caused, or anything of that type, study the history of the war, study the history of that people, find out what was really going on back in those days, and then make up your mind.